Paul Eric Strauss is an American politician and attorney serving as a senior United States Shadow Senator from the District of Columbia since 1997. The post of Shadow United States Senator is held by elected or appointed government officials from subnational polities of the United States that lack congressional vote. Paul Strauss succeeded Jesse Jackson, the first person to hold the elected position of a shadow senator for Washington, D.C. He is a member of the Democratic Party. He is an honorary member of the Global Committee for the Rule of Law. In 2015, Strauss appeared before a panel of the Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization and, citing the lack of statehood for Washington, D.C., successfully petitioned for the District of Columbia to become the first and only North American participant in the international body. Joining me today on the Capitol TV show, Senator Paul Strauss. You're most welcome. Senator, can you explain, as a senator elected for Washington, D.C., what is the difference between you and the other senators from other states?
Well, Washington, D.C. is the federal district, but it's not one of the 50 states. And so, as a result of that, we don't have the same rights that citizens in the state have. In the election for D.C. senators, the voters go to the polls and vote for me, but when I go to the Capitol building in the Senate, I'm not allowed to cast a vote on behalf of the people who voted for me. That's unfair. It doesn't give me the same power that other senators have, and it's one of the reasons why Washington, D.C. residents want real equality.
Yeah, you were the force behind Washington, D.C. joining the UNPO. The UNPO is Unrepresented Nations and Peoples Organization. Many were surprised how come that D.C. is joining this ethnic groups like Ahwazi, Kurds, Blush, and Uyghurs. What was the thought process behind such a move?
Well, the UNPO is this coalition of unrepresented nations and territories, including many oppressed ethnic minorities around the world. And while Washington, D.C.'s disenfranchisement in the American political system takes a different form than some of the very brutal repression of these other groups, there are still some underlying similarities in international law when you deny political equality to your citizens. And so I thought it would be helpful for the people of Washington, D.C. to get a more international perspective when we try and air our grievances against our own government. And it's helpful to study other groups with grievances against their governments to learn best practices and how we can have ideas and what we can do, not necessarily to adopt each other's cause, because every situation is different, but to learn at least how we can work together to promote democracy, freedom, self-determination, and ideals that we should all share as human beings. Lack of equality that we have in Washington, D.C. is very different than some of the members who are ethnic minorities in places like Iran, for example, where the repression is far more brutal. Our grievances are more political in nature, but there are enough similarities that made it an appropriate fit. We all want to promote democracy, self-determination, freedom. These are human rights and human values. And so when human beings can work across cultural and international lines, we could bring strength to each other's movements and arguments, not that we adopt the specific causes of one member or another, but working together we can accomplish more.
What was the reception that you get from these groups, these people from all over the world?
Well, I think it was a little skeptical at first. After all, many of these groups come to the United States and look to U.S. government as a force for providing political freedom and equality. And so to hear that not everybody in the United States had an equal level of freedom and equality is initially surprising to them. But as they come to understand our issue and view it in the context of their grievances against their governments, they come to see that there are more things that we have in common than differences. And it's so wonderful to work with so many diverse cultures. Fundamentally, as human beings, we want the same human rights. We want to live in peace, we want freedom, we want equality, but we also want self-determination. We want to be able to speak our own languages. We want to be able to practice our own religions. We want to be able to make sure that our children grow up in safety. And so the ability to work across international lines and share common values, I think, has added a lot to the statehood effort for the people of Washington, D.C., and helped bring an appreciation for human rights around the world.
How can you, as an American politician, especially in particular you are from Jewish descent, find a common ground with the Muslim ethnic groups?
Well, I have not had a problem as an American of Jewish descent working with so many of these predominantly Muslim groups around the world, because there's really more that unites us in our goals and aspirational wishes than divides us. Many of these groups have seen the dangers of religious discrimination and oppression, and they understand that for diversity and freedom to flourish, that we must respect each other's differences. And so I have actually found it to be a very positive experience. There's so much that we can learn from one another. Really, we're all cousins of the same family, and I think that it is helpful to continue to work across state law and with these international actors towards promoting human rights around the world.
Do you have new ideas how the Biden administration can deal with these groups or stateless people and their organizations?
Well, I think unlike the Trump administration, they're going to take the issue more seriously. We've celebrated recently in the United States a holiday honoring our Martin Luther King, who talked about how injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And I think the Biden administration understands that this is one of the American values and ideals that we need to promote around the world. And so you never heard the Trump administration mention the struggle of disenfranchised and unrepresented populations. Joe Biden is committed to advancing not just America's strategic interests, but promoting the values of the American people around the world. And that means getting back to our international alliances, whether it's NATO and the OSCE in Europe or the OAS here in the Americas, and just promoting human rights around the world through organizations like the UN. Look, we're back on the International Human Rights Commission. We're engaging again with the international community. I think that's going to be a much more positive step than some of the unilateral go-it-alone approaches from the last administration.
Why is the desire for statehood is very strong for D.C. residents, in your opinion?
Washington, D.C., as anyone who's visited here can tell you, is a wonderful city. But we have problems managing it because of our relationship with the Congress. Congress doesn't allow the city to govern its own affairs. And in recent years, that's become very dangerous for us because, for example, in the insurrection that we had, the government couldn't call out the National Guard quickly and protect the Capitol close enough because the mayor didn't have the authority that the governor of a state would. When it was giving out resources to fight the coronavirus, D.C. only got 1/3 of them compared to a state because we didn't have the same rights. And so viruses, mob violence don't necessarily follow political boundaries. We need equality. It's important to the people of Washington, D.C. We pay the same taxes that Americans pay. We support this country. We want the rights that are guaranteed to all its citizens.
What is the D.C. statehood movement situation now, status, and the political climate issue?
Well, D.C. statehood can be achieved by legislation passed by the Congress. The lower house, the House of Representatives, has passed the bill. It has 46 sponsors in the Senate, which is more than it's ever had. It has the support of the President. It has the support of the Vice President. But we don't yet have that supermajority needed to break a filibuster. And so many issues right now when it comes to voting rights and protecting democracy here in America are threatened by that filibuster, and it's one of the fundamental issues that we have in fighting for justice in our Congress. But we're not giving up, and we hope that one day Washington, D.C. will take its place among the 50 states and become the 51st.
Senator Strauss, we're going to move to another questions on the international or foreign affairs policy. How do you see the this administration policy toward the Middle East?
I think it's going to be much more effective than the last administration. Joe Biden understands the need to work in international coalitions and, more importantly, to promote the values of the American people and not just the strategic interests of the nation. And so there's going to be a renewed commitment to human rights. There's going to be a more sincere effort to bring multilateral solutions and peace, a greater reliance on career diplomats as opposed to family friends these diplomats will have more experience in dealing with the complexities of the region. There will be a greater understanding and a more thoughtful process. So for those who are looking for instant action, there may be a need for some patience as we take a more deliberative and exploratory approach to solving some very old and very complex problems. But I think if we have a policy failure, and we might, it will be because we have not lived up to the ideals as opposed to abandoning them.
Many in the Middle East think that the Biden administration failed because of what we are seeing from the Houthis and the Iraqi militia in the Middle East. How do you see that?
Well, I think Joe Biden's still early into his first term, and so I don't know that we've had a failure of any policies. I think what you're seeing is a slower, more deliberate process that relies on career diplomats and not just family and friends in the region. Violence in Yemen is a terrible problem and something that we need to address, but it's certainly nothing that Joe Biden started, and it's certainly nothing that I think is going to be ignored. He's going to be looking at a series of complex options, but I think it would be not quite fair to call it a policy failure. At this point, this president is dealing with problems here in the United States, around the world, and he's certainly not going to ignore what's happening in the Middle East.
A recent article in the Atlantic Monthly wrote that even more significantly, a decision regarding a potential Houthi terrorist designation must be considered in the context of the most important single geopolitical factor in the region. Do you agree on this?
I think it should be considered, but I think you have to make a decision like that carefully. Certainly the lack of the designation has not encouraged good behavior on their part, but it's not clear that reinstituting the designation will have the kind of deterrent effect that we need. We can't ignore the violence that's happening there, but we need to be careful that if we engage, we do so constructively and simply not expand American involvement into another war.
The Biden administration they condemn the attacks from the Houthis on UAE, United Arab Emirates, recently. So do you think that they will reinstall this organization on the FTO list?
It's under consideration, and there's certainly evidence that would justify that designation, but the most important thing is not to be throwing names around, but to craft real solutions that will end the violence and the incursions, and a lot of that has to do with how we address Iran and other actors in the region that are behind and actively promoting such instability.
There was a move recently that the Pentagon sent or offered the UAE security help by sending them planes to defend themselves against the terrorist attacks. So how do you see that?
American military policy has to be there to back up American diplomatic policy, and I think that that's the type of appropriate move where we're supporting an ally in the region with military support. But I'm hoping the Biden administration will continue to lead through diplomacy and have America's military support our diplomatic efforts rather than starting with a military solution before we give diplomacy a chance.
Is there a synergy in the way Iran is moving and directing this militia in the region and in the Arabic and Islamic world?
There is synergy, but it's bad synergy. Iran continues to be a horrific actor in the region and promoting all kinds of terrorist activities in that area. Obviously, preventing Iran from becoming a nuclear power is important to the security and stability in the world, but we also have to address Iran's abuse of conventional warfare as well, and its supporting of terrorist activities against so many countries in that region. It's probably the greatest threat to instability of the region, and as aggressively as we want to stop them from becoming a nuclear power, we can't ignore what they're doing with non-nuclear weapons, the loss of life, the terrible attacks, and the violence that they're perpetuating. So we must be aggressive in addressing the threat that this regime poses.
But we see that Biden is rushing to embrace Iran despite the criminal records of its president, Ibrahim Raisi.
I don't know that Biden is rushing to embrace Iran. Look, we hope one day that there will be a lasting peace between the Iranian people and the United States, but that's very different than supporting this current Iranian regime. But we have to try solutions that are going to work, and ignoring the regime is as bad as ignoring the problem. We have to do our best to engage with them and promote to the extent that we can the type of relationship that will encourage good behavior as well as challenging the violent behavior that we need them to stop.
Can Biden assure its allies in the Middle East that his administration will not, or the U.S. will not abandon them?
I think so. Joe Biden would have never done to the Kurds what the last president did and abandoned them despite such a loyal allied relationship. Obviously, there is concern about what happened in Afghanistan, but that was, I think, an inability to live up to the ideals that we're trying to promote and not a deliberate turning away from them. And so I think that Biden administration understands that America's long-term relationship with its allies are more important than any one administration. The American people are good allies to its friends in the Middle East, and whoever the president is, the United States has to speak with consistent values. And that includes not just the advancement of strategic interests, whether it's economic or military, but advancing human rights, particularly in those areas where America needs to lead by example.
So it's not fair to say that the Biden administration is no more an ally or a reliable ally after the failure in Afghanistan? What happened there?
No, I don't think it's fair. I think it's tragic what happened in Afghanistan. The United States was there for almost 30 years. It was a tremendous cost in terms of lives and resources. In hindsight, probably there were things that could have been done better to prepare for America's inevitable withdrawal, but it does not mean that America's commitment to peace and values and human rights is any less. Joe Biden is someone that is going to try and make America live up to those values. We are a country of high ideals. We don't always live up to them ourselves, but we strive to be better, and that's what makes us an enduring people and a nation who its allies can count on.
Senator Paul Strauss, thank you so much for being on my show. I'm so glad to have you and to have this interview, especially from the University Club, the Franklin Room. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hey, Maria Malouf here. Please click to like and subscribe to Maria Malouf TV YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.